Good evening, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here and an honor to be speaking with Jhumpa Lahiri. My name is Maaza Mengiste. I'm the author of The Shadow King, and I'll be moderating tonight's conversation. Just a few things. We're broadcasting on Crowdcast, and we want you to be a part of the conversation. The chat is open for your comments. PEN America staff will also be answering your questions in the chat throughout the event and sharing information about the participants. If you have questions, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen for your questions. This event will be live captioned. Please see links in the chat for access, and we will provide periodic visual descriptions for low vision viewers in our audience. Right now, we are in a frame on the left side of the screen. We see branding for PEN America and the PEN World Voices Festival in the corners. And there's a chat with lots of comments on the side where people are telling us where they're watching from. So let's get started for tonight. Tonight, Jhumpa Lahiri and I will be in conversation to talk about her new novel, Whereabouts. I use the pronouns she, her, and I'm a Black female with curly hair, wearing a black top with white stripes. And I'll give a brief introduction for Jhumpa. Jhumpa Lahiri is an award-winning writer whose work has been called a writer of uncommon sensitivity and restraint. We will be speaking more about Whereabouts, also titled Dove mi trovo in Italian. And I'd like to welcome her now and begin with a question. And Jhumpa, you can feel free to provide pronouns and introduce yourself. But I'd like to begin by asking you if you can remember exactly when you knew that Italy was a culture, or Italian was a culture, and Italy was a country that you wanted to know better.
Thank you, Maaza. It's so nice to be talking to you this evening. Thank you for doing this. Thank you to everybody at PEN for inviting me, for having the two of us together. It's a great pleasure and honor, as always. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a brown woman with a blue dress tonight, and sitting in a book-lined study in Princeton, New Jersey. Which is a far place, far cry from Rome, Italy, where this book was born, and is in some sense set, though I never specify that. And I don't know how to answer your question, Maaza. I mean, it was such a process, you know, of coming to realize how powerful the pull was going to be, and how deep I would go. I didn't know in the beginning. I mean, I can trace back way back to when I was a young girl, and I was always fascinated by Rome in particular, by ancient Rome, and reports. I remember writing reports on ancient Rome and on Etruscan art, and learning all sorts of things about Rome and pre-Rome, and that whole world was very central to my imagination, I think, as a young girl. But that was a very long time ago, and then, you know, it sort of ebbed and flowed, you know, the relationship, which was largely in my head for so long, and then only eventually became an actual destination, an actual place that I visited and then went back to, and then began to forge a relationship with.
You know, learning any language is, you know, really difficult. And I know you've written about some of some of the process of learning Italian. And I was curious about whether there's any part of the writing process that felt similar to you to learning another language.
Well, I think the writing of every book is a learning process, right? No matter what language you're writing in. So in that sense, it's familiar because every book puts you at the bottom of the mountain again. And it's always a different mountain anyway. So it doesn't really help if you already climbed one before, because you have to do it again. And it's going to present new challenges no matter what. So, yes, I mean, I think, writing this book is part of a trajectory of learning the language as well, right? So it's two things. It's both climbing a new mountain in terms of writing a new book, but also, using a new language to tell the new story. So there's a sort of double challenge. There was a double challenge in the writing of it, and then there was the final step, which was to translate the book out of Italian and into English, which was something I had also never done before, never experienced.
I wonder, in your experience translating other writers from Italian into English, if you started to realize something new about the English language at all, maybe the differences between them created another recognition of this other language that you've been using all along.
Well, I think that's sort of, one of the objectives in a way. I mean, is to understand, to see here as there and there as here, right? And that's what happens when you make any kind of voyage, whether it's geographic or linguistic or what have you. So moving into Italian, of course, made me recognize more acutely, sort of the texture of English, the advantages of English, the things English couldn't do in the same way, because each language is a universe, right? Each language is its own extraordinary, mysterious, self-contained system, and it's only by moving amongst them, right, moving through them and between them, that one begins to understand the profound mystery that is language, and that is also each individual language, right, and the ways in which they overlap and shade into one another or not, the ways that they, I think what's unique to each language and also common to every language is that each language has things that no other language can do, right? And yet there are many things that they also do and say that are in common, right? But they each have sort of unique traits, right? Languages have unique traits, and when you get into a language, then you begin to understand and appreciate those unique traits that are specific to the language. And I think that, I was certainly aware of that as I was translating the work of other Italian authors, and that was very important to me to translate other people before trying to translate my own work. That was a crucial step, I would say.
Thank you. I think this is a good time to ask if you could read something for us from your book, perhaps in Italian and also in English.
Okay, sure. Well, I'll just read the first section. There are 46 short chapters in the book, and each one is in a different setting. So this one is called, in Italian, it's called sul marciapiede, which means on the sidewalk. So I'll read it first in Italian, and then I will read it in English. Sul marciapiede. Al mattino, dopo colazione, supero una piccola lapide di marmo, appoggiata contro il muro alto della strada. Non ho mai conosciuto il morto, eppure con gli anni conosco il suo nome, il cognome. So il mese e il giorno della sua nascita e della scomparsa. È morto quest'uomo 2 giorni dopo il suo compleanno, a febbraio. Deve essere stato un incidente in bici o in moto, oppure camminava di notte, sbadato. Forse è stato investito in pieno. Ha perso la vita a 44 anni. È mancato, mi immagino, proprio qui, su questo marciapiede, accanto al muro da cui spuntano delle piante trascurate, per cui la lapide si trova in basso, ai piedi dei passanti. È una strada serpeggiante, in salita, un po' pericolosa. Il marciapiede è scomodo. Emergono le radici degli alberi. Certi tratti sono quasi impraticabili per via di quelle radici. Infatti, anch'io tendo a camminare in mezzo alla strada. Di solito c'è una candela accesa in un contenitore di vetro rosso, insieme a un piccolo mazzo di fiori e la statuetta di un santo. Nessuna foto però di lui. Sopra la candela, attaccata al muro, c'è una nota scritta a mano dalla madre, protetta da un involucro smunto di plastica. Un saluto a quelli che si fermano un attimo per riflettere sulla scomparsa del figlio. Sarei felice di ringraziare personalmente chi dedica qualche momento del suo tempo a mio figlio, ma se non sarà possibile, ringrazio comunque con tutto il cuore, c'è scritto. Non ho mai visto né la madre né nessun altro davanti alla lapide. Penso tanto alla madre quanto al figlio, poi continuo sentendomi un pochino meno viva. And now I'll move on to the English version. On the sidewalk. In the mornings after breakfast, I walk past a small marble plaque propped against the high wall flanking the road. I never knew the man who died, but over the years I've come to know his name, his surname. I know the month and day he was born, and the month and day his life ended. This was a man who died 2 days after his birthday, in February. It must have been an accident on his bike or his motorcycle. Or maybe he was walking at night, distracted. Maybe he was hit by a passing car. He was 44 when it happened. I suppose he died in this very spot, on the sidewalk, next to the wall that sprouts neglected plants, which is why the plaque has been arranged at the bottom, at the feet of passers-by. The road is full of curves and snakes uphill. It's a bit dangerous. The sidewalk is vexing, crowded with exposed tree roots. Some sections are nearly impossible to negotiate because of the roots. That's why I, too, tend to walk on the road. There's usually a candle burning in a container of red glass, along with a small bunch of flowers and the statue of a saint. There's no photograph of him. Above the candle, attached to the wall, there's a note from his mother, written by hand, encased in a milky plastic sleeve. It greets those who stop for a moment to ponder the death of her son. I would like to personally thank those who dedicate a few minutes of their time to my son's memory. But if that's not possible, I thank you anyway, from the bottom of my heart, it says. I've never seen the mother or any other person in front of the plaque. Thinking of the mother just as much as the son, I keep walking, feeling slightly less alive.
Thank you so much, Jhumpa. That was beautiful. One of the most striking elements in the book is the writing. the spareness and the control that you exhibit. This is employed in a story about a woman who is alone. And I often think that this book is about solitude and what could have been and yet what wasn't. That seems to be a thread that runs throughout. I'm wondering if you could talk more about the connection between the language, its spareness, and this character's solitude. Was there a connection there?
I don't know. I mean, I think, the book was born with a certain tonality, and I was just hearing it in a certain way, and I felt that it's the book in which I'm most focused on the words that I've ever written, which is probably not surprising, since I'm so I have to be extra vigilant when I'm writing in Italian. I try to be vigilant in English as well, of course, but there's an extra, there's an extra layer because each word is chosen with a different sensibility and in a different, always with some degree still of wonder that I can even express myself in this language, which I don't take for granted ever, but I don't know. I think I met the character somewhere, and she started to talk to me, and I started to write in her voice, right? Mm-hmm. I tried to sort of hear how she would be describing things, and but it's so much of writing any book is about the ear and what how you hear it, right? And so I felt that in this book there was going to be a certain cadence, and a certain austerity as well.
Mm-hmm. That comes through really clearly and in such beautiful ways. What I noted several times when reading this, and I would underline certain passages, is the spareness at some moments would be disrupted by these beautiful descriptions, or just a moment when she seems to sink into an observation that creates this incredible language and depth, which was really lovely to read and encounter. I wondered throughout this, thinking about your translation process, is this a different book in translation to you?
Mm-hmm. Yes and no. Yes and no. I think both are true. It's not the same book. I mean, I should start by saying it's not the same book at all. It's a radically different book. It's a book in another language. And because, I mean, even when I'm translating the work of other people, I am profoundly aware of how different it is. I'm profoundly aware of how different the text I've created through translation differs from the spirit and the texture and the flavor of the thing in Italian, right? And so with this project, of course, I'm aware of that as well. And even as I move from, just reading a brief section in Italian to English, I mean, there are things I tried to maintain, again, mostly about the rhythm and about the way the sentences are built. But of course, the languages are so different that there is no process of substitution that is rational, right? That is logical. There are no easy answers, and so to me, it's a drastically different book. But at the same time, the substance of it is generally the same, right? So the same thing, I describe the same thing, the same character, the same point of view, the same reflections, and everything is there. Everything that's in the Italian book is also, one finds it in the English book in the same order, more or less, and yet it's radically different at the same time, right?
Yeah, I kept wondering as I was reading this, whether you ever had the urge at some points to go back into the Italian and change something because of the way that the English was seeming to come through. I wondered if you discovered anything translating yourself into English.
I did change the Italian text again. I mean, they were microscopic things, I think, to a reader, but they were significant enough for me to want to change. So, because every time you translate something, given that translation is the most acute and sort of exhaustive form of reading, and I mean that in a good way, in a positive way, you will become aware of that text in a way that you cannot even while writing it, right? So even in the writing of Dove mi trovo, I still wasn't able to come as close as I did to it in the act of translation, in which I had to read the book I had written I don't know how many times, right? So, and I've never done that before with any other book I've ever written. I've never had the occasion or the desire, for that matter, to go back and look at it with such deep scrutiny. But I did. So, and if anybody is interested out there, I did write an essay on this process, in which I talk about how sort of one translation, how the English translation actually went back and jostled the Italian text, which is a fascinating process if you think about it. And what you realize is that there is it completely sort of interrogates deeply the question of the original text, and what is the original and what is the translation. Because in my case, the translation, the act of translation, made me go back and adjust the original text, right? Which lost its sort of veneer as the original and became yet again a work in progress. So that was really so illuminating to me. And anyway, if anybody is interested in sort of reading about this, reading my thoughts on this, there's an essay I wrote on the Words Without Borders website. It came out a couple of weeks ago, and there I sort of walk the reader through the entire process of how I came to this translation and what my misgivings were and what I discovered in the process of doing it.
Thank you, Jhumpa. And I think that's an essay everybody should read, and hopefully we can have it put into the chat for audience members to read later. I'd like to switch gears now and talk a little bit about the book itself. I was struck, even in this section that you read, but throughout the book, I was struck by the narrator's sense of time. If she's acutely aware of routines, the passage of seasons, the passage of months. There's a moment in the book where she remembers from her childhood getting an early birthday gift from her father, and her mother warns them that it's bad luck to celebrate birthdays early. I don't want to give too much away about that particular moment, but here, as in other places, this narrator is cognizant of the passage of time, of the way things move. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about this, the way that time presents itself in the novel or the book.
Well, I mean, I think the book is very much about the passage of time, even though it's ostensibly about place, right? Each of these episodes is set in a specific place, and then the title, which is, sort of centering that idea of place, location, so forth and so forth. But I think place and time are of course linked, right? And what happens is, as these episodes accumulate, they begin to incorporate things like, places like in spring or in summer or in, so the seasons become places, but they're not really. They're spans of time, right? Among other things. So I think that it's both. It's a meditation on space, on movements, and of course, what are we doing when we're moving? We're moving through time, right? We're moving from one day literally to another, or from one moment to another. And I think that's what the book is really looking at, is that the fact that, we are not, that time is moving, right? We know time is moving, and we are moving through it. So I think, just in a very distilled way, that's what the book is, what the narrator is sort of meditating on in the course of this year. It's a rather simple arc, and in terms of the sequence of actions, plot, if you will. It's really quite subtle, what happens in the book. But I think it's got a different type of. It's looking at life in a through a different filter, and it's quite. It's not an entirely interior filter. She's actually quite out and about and engaging and interacting with people in her life on an ongoing basis. So it's not that we are sort of in her head and we're with her thoughts, and that's it, right? And or just even in terms of a character and memory and perception. She's moving. She is literally moving from place to place and from day to day.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, as soon as you started saying that, just an aside, I was thinking about that wonderful scene where she discovers that a child has written on her white leather sofa, which was just a brilliant moment of the interactions of the world that come in. The world seems to come in and disrupt her in many ways. We're in the tight confines of this novel, and we're following a narrator whose name we never learn. This is also a novel about place, but the city goes unnamed. And I was thinking about the ways that your work in English was so grounded in specificity. And I wondered if this was a deliberate choice to remove some of these markers when writing this book in Italian.
Mm-hmm. Well, I removed the markers, but I don't think it's any less specific, if that makes sense, right? I think this is a novel that is looking so intensely, almost microscopically at setting, right? And describing place, among other things. So I don't think that specificity is that's not what I wanted to take away. What I wanted to take away are, as you say, the markers, the labels, the names that actually reduce our understanding or our ability to perceive or imagine what a place is, right? So then it's a question of what is place, right? So then the novel opens up the question of what is place if it's not this place as opposed to that place. What is place? What is our place? How do we feel? Why do we feel in place or out of place, right? Why do we thirst for this idea of feeling at home or in place, right? So I think that's interesting me more and more. There have been questions about, the identity of this woman. So people are saying, readers sort of intuit, oh, this is some sort of Italian city. It seems like Rome. And people have even said to me, oh, well, your protagonist is Roman. And then I throw this back and I say, well, what does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean to be a Roman woman? Tell me, and it is interesting to hear, to hear what people immediately sort of go to as the, as what would be the, how to describe this individual. Of course, there's so many more possibilities than what we sort of hold on to in the beginning, right? So I think this book, for me, it's a book that is really beginning to open up and dismantle in ways that are interesting to me right now, questions of identity and how to look at those questions differently, right? Not to say these questions aren't important, but to look at the questions differently, because I think that there are different ways I think if we look at the question differently, then maybe the definitions will also become more accommodating, more inclusive, in fact, right?
Yeah, that it was wonderful to hear you say to question place, and also to ask, what is this woman's place? This woman is, so I'll use the word isolated, but I think she's, in many ways, she's quite grateful for the times that she's alone, and she's quite grateful for the space that she has carved out for herself in this city. But I wondered what you wanted to explore about that place that this woman is, whether we call it loneliness or solitude or isolation or something else. What was it that you wanted to really develop with this character?
I wanted to look carefully at a woman who was alone in an urban setting. I wanted to see how female solitude and the city are in dialogue, or can be in dialogue, and I wanted to explore how cities specifically can be sort of, can accompany an individual, can antagonize an individual, how much home is actually about the public spaces, as well as sort of the technical space indoors of someone's home or apartment. So I wanted to look at these some of these questions. Once I began to understand a little bit more about this character, and sort of where she was in life, and some of the choices she had made, some of the choices that had perhaps been made for her, for whatever reason, she finds herself in her mid-40s on her own. And I wanted to explore how she would navigate that experience, and to what degree it would be galvanizing for her, to what degree she would be take ownership of this, to what degree she would enjoy the freedom that she has, and also to what degree she did struggle, right? Because I think that solitude is something that each of us, needs to come to grips with in some form or another, right? Because it is a part of life. Mm-hmm. Solitude is a part of who we are, and each of us needs to sort of understand and appreciate that fact. And I feel that we live so much now, more than ever, in a world where there are illusions their devices, shall we say, to create sort of, layers and layers of ongoing 24 hours a day connectivity. And I think that's interesting to me, just because of my age and because of the particular slice of life that I've lived and witnessed, and to realize that solitude was declined differently, when I was a child, and at any rate, and so I am curious about these questions. Of course, as a writer, as someone who spends a lot of time alone and has had to really create a relationship with solitude, right? For good or for ill, because it's not always easy. And then there are times when I'm desperate for it, right? Yeah. So hungry for it. And as you know, Maaza, our work depends on it. There's no other way it will be produced. There's just no other. There's no other. It's a prerequisite, right? And not just being alone in a room, but sort of a different layer of solitude that the writer is experiencing when writing, anchored often in entirely different time periods, anchored in different places, anchored in realities that are not our own, anchored in places that maybe we haven't even ever set foot in. So that is the case, right? That is the case for people who write. That is the case for many people who are creative. But no matter who we are, I think solitude is inevitably something we build a relationship with, right? And what is that other than building a relationship with ourselves, and sort of acknowledging that relationship. So I think that's what this book is, among other things. That's one of the things that this woman is reflecting on.
Thank you for that. It just struck me as I was listening to you that you were likely in some part of this writing process for this book, I'm assuming, while we were all in lockdown, which seems to add another layer to this conversation about solitude. We're all slowly moving out of this, at least here in the United States, moving out of this pandemic, but we were directly confronted with various layers of solitude and loneliness during the lockdown. It just resonated with me as you were talking. We have about 5 minutes before Q&A, and I really want to get in at least a couple of questions. You have noted before in interviews, I believe, Jhumpa, that you say that you've existed in a kind of linguistic exile, and that English sometimes felt like a bullying stepmother. And I wondered about if you could talk about that, and does writing in Italian speak to this linguistic exile that you've mentioned before?
It complicates it. It adds another layer. It confirms the fact that I feel both inside and outside of language always. I always have. I've never fully felt grounded in any language, and I think for much of my life, because there was more of a polarity between two, right, between Bengali and English, two languages with which I have very profound relationships, but very different levels of kind of proficiency, if you will, right? But languages that were in competition with each other, at least in my head and in my heart, and came to signify, that split, or that the coexistence of those two languages came to signify so many things for life generally, and how I was sort of moving through life and reading life, interpreting life. And Italian is, a new language with which I've now formed a significant relationship. And I feel, in a different way, both inside and outside of that language as well, right? But it's just that they're three different languages that with different proportions of inside and outside, sort of depending on what the context is and what the situation is, right? So I think that I think it hasn't resolved anything, as I say in other words. It doesn't resolve anything to bring in another language, but it only complicates things. But it can also provide a great deal of clarity, and I think that that's what I think once I incorporated a third language, a language that I chose, a language that there was no expectation for me to learn. It was, in that sense, it was liberating in that it felt, I felt that I could have a relationship with a language that didn't have sort of external, that wasn't about an external conversation or conflict, for that matter.
Thank you for that so much, Jhumpa. I think it's time now for some of our audience questions, and I see in chat that we have one already. The question is, in other words, you said you were uncertain about translating your works from Italian to English for fear of losing some part of the freedom of writing Italian if you translated it to English. What made you want to translate Whereabouts?
I was curious about what it would be like, and I felt less scared that translation would somehow undo Italian, right? I mean, I think when I wrote, in other words, I was still so new to it all, and I think that there was a sort of paranoia that because I was so focused on maintaining a discipline in Italian and reading only in Italian and writing almost entirely in Italian for years, and so the fear was that if I were to, that it was like I had knitted up this big sweater, and to translate it would have been to just pull that yarn and go and then see the whole thing. That was the feeling that I had, So knitters can know what that feels like. So and so I didn't want that to happen, because I had struggled, I'd labored so long and hard to make this Italian sweater, right? But I realized eventually that, and this took time. This was a process. It took time for the language to set down roots, and for me to realize that that Italian was no longer about how often I was going back to Italy, how many conversations a day I had in Italian, how many books I was reading in Italian. Like suddenly, I mean, those things are always, they reinforce the relationship. But there was a point in which I realized that the graft that I was trying to, to create had taken hold, and that the language was inside of me, and that it wasn't going to go anywhere. And in fact, if anything, it was just putting down deeper roots. So at that point, the idea of translating myself to English is a new. It's a new layer. It's a new iteration of this whole experiment, right? Without threatening the base of the Italian base, right? But that's changed. That's changed since 5 years ago. It's a very different. I feel at a very different place, and already I'm at a different place from. I mean, I wrote this book long before the pandemic. And it was published in 2018, and I even translated it before the pandemic. I translated it in 2019, before the pandemic.
Oh, yeah.
I was looking at the proofs of the translation during the pandemic. So that was the only time when it occurred to me that the book had there were some strange echoes now, when I was reading it, vis-a-vis, themes of solitude and isolation. Though in fact, she's very freely, this character is very freely moving about her city. So it's sort of the opposite of the lockdown, because she's actually moving all over the place, right?
It's true. Very true. Thank you. We have a second question from the audience. I'm very curious if in the writing in Italian, there were ever any passages that you wrote first in English and then went back to translate in Italian, even if it was just a word or phrase.
No, I didn't write anything or think of anything in English. I wouldn't be writing in Italian if I were to do that, I mean, I think the point is to be swimming in another body of water and not sort of looking for the other language, right? So and which is why I was so hesitant actually to translate the book into English. Not even myself. I was hesitant. I was doubtful about the book being translated at all into English, whether by me or by somebody else, because I had conceived it and written it in Italian. It seemed to me that it could only be an Italian book, right? And then that also took some reflection and reconsideration. So, I mean, I think what this has taught me also is that the first impulse, the first sort of attitude that we have towards something is not necessarily the case, right? That things do need to be reconsidered, can be reconsidered.
That is a really good reminder, Jhumpa. And now we have a third question. Much of your body of work deals exquisitely and tenderly with Indian diasporic immigrant experiences in the West. What inspired you to create a racially unmarked protagonist in Whereabouts?
I think that this book is distilling themes I've been exploring from the very beginning with in all of the books. I think the book is very much about sort of themes of alienation and sort of feelings of belonging and not belonging, right? So I think if that's the core of what I've been exploring in my writing from the beginning, I feel like that this book is in some sense, it's not a departure at all. If anything, it's the most distilled version of everything that I've written so far is in this book, because in this book we see a character who embodies the foreign, right? The idea of feeling foreign, but we don't understand. We actually don't understand. We don't know where she's from. We just know that she's lived in one place for her whole life. But that could mean so many things, right? It's just that, again, the specifics are taken away, right? But that's not to say, I mean, her family could be from anywhere in the world, right? So I think so in my mind, I don't know if I'm answering the question that the person asked, but to my mind, it's just, a sort of continuation of the same question that is being declined in a new book, in a new context. I think it's important to look at things differently. I think it's important because the questions I'm asking, again, there are no clear answers to those questions, and I have not successfully resolved those questions. Look, I cannot say, after having written these books, oh, this is what it means to belong or to not belong. There are no answers to these questions. It's so complex, the question of belonging. It's so complex, the question of sort of what home is, what home can be, how to make home. I was watching this really interesting documentary the other day about a poet named Robert Lax. I'm going to be going to the Greek island of Patmos in a couple of months, and Robert Lax was an American poet who lived in Patmos, and he says something in this incredible documentary about his life. He says, identity is memory. And if you take memory away, what do you have? What do you do with the question of identity? I thought that was so interesting and thought-provoking, you know?
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. We have a last question, and I am going to read this question, but if there is any time at all, Jhumpa, I would love to hear you say a couple of words on your upcoming Ovid translation work that was just recently announced. So I'll read this last question. Can you offer words of inspiration to my aspiring ESL writer students who are struggling with writing and finding their true voice in English?
I don't know. I just, you know, you have to work through it. You have to be brave, and you have to believe that language doesn't belong to anybody. Okay? So anybody who wants to, anybody who has the will and the determination and perhaps the love can enter into language, you know, and I think that's what is so extraordinary about language, because language is, as I said, they're systems, right? They're very rigorous systems. They're they can seem very intolerant for those who don't know the system, right? But they're not nation states. Okay, so the borders that are around a language are not the same as the borders that are around nation states, and they're not governed in the same way. What governs language is grammar and syntax and vocabulary, things like that. But in the end, we as human beings cannot even govern language, right? Language is beyond our control, right? Language is like the ocean, right? I mean, we can use it as a huge resource, and we can revel in its beauty, and we can live off of it as we live, right? Through water and because of water and things like that, but we cannot actually control it. And that's what I would tell those students. I would tell those students to not be daunted, because if you want to write in another language, you have absolutely every right to do that, right? Because the language will accommodate you if you want it to, if you need it to, right? Because there's nothing to forbid someone from knowing a language. And I think this is really an extraordinary thing, you know? It's like there are these incredibly closed systems when you think about them, but actually they're not, right? They're there. They're there for the learning. They're there for the taking, you know? I mean, you go to the library, you get the dictionary, you get the grammar book, you take a class, you work with somebody, and you learn it, you know, and you learn it, and it becomes a part of you. And I mean, that's the only reason I know Italian, and it's really the only reason we know any language, right? Is because we learn it. We learn it from the people perhaps who raise us, or the worlds we live in, or the schools we go to, or the situations we find ourselves in, right? But we do learn them. Anyway, I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Jhumpa. That helped me too. That was great. I love the idea of language as an ocean, which makes it just feel vast, and the possibilities of where to move within it seem endless. I thank you for that. And we do have, I've been told, we do have just a few minutes to hear you talk about maybe some of the new projects you have and this Ovid translation that you just announced recently, or was announced.
Yeah, I think it was announced. So yeah, I'm now I've embarked on probably the most daunting translation project of my life, which is to translate the entirety of the Metamorphoses from Latin to English with a colleague and friend of mine here at Princeton. Her name is Yelena Baraz, and she's an extraordinary classicist. And we met and collaborated and taught a course together actually last semester in the depths of the pandemic. And we taught Ovid, among other authors, in that class. And so she knew how central Ovid was to my, to my life and to my world, to my sanity. At what an incredibly sort of the thing about Ovid's poem, of course, is the protagonist is change, right? And what occurs to me now is that I first read Ovid when I was an undergraduate reading in Latin, and the relationship to that book has changed so powerfully over time, and that's it's a whole other layer of the book, because it's a book about change. It's an enormous poem about change. And if you make it a part of your life, which I have, I've read Ovid and I've thought about Ovid for decades now, and written about him, and so now translating him. What's really fascinating to me now about going back to Latin is that I'm now reading Latin through my Italian. So when I first studied Latin in college, I only had English, right, to sort of translate, out of Latin and into English. And now when I translate the Latin, I very seldom even use an English Latin dictionary. I mean, I do, but I also have the Italian Latin dictionary, because there's so many words, obviously, that now that now that I have Italian, and my Italian is much stronger than my Latin, though I'm hoping by the time I get to the end of the 15 books, my Latin will also, have come up several notches from its dormancy from my undergraduate years. But yeah, it's really interesting, because it's putting these three languages, it's putting three new languages into play, actually. So it's a wonderful thing. It's so thrilling, really, to be able to think about working on this project, which will take years. I mean, we just finished book one, just a first draft of book one, and in fact, today I was in the library translating, and at a certain point, I just stood up, I lifted my head from the desk, and I counted. I said, okay, I've just translated 40 lines, and that was 3 hours, and that's just a first go. So it will take its time, but it's extraordinary, because translation, talking about time, it slows time down completely. I mean, I will think about one line. I'll just sit there and think about it for 10 or 15 minutes, and think about how I would like to put it together in English. And so it's not really, I think it just operates in another dimension in some sense. Anyway, that's one of the new projects.
Thank you so much, Jhumpa. I think this is an excellent place to end for the evening. I cannot thank you enough for sharing sharing your ideas and this book and your thoughts with us tonight. I'd like to thank everyone who has joined us, members of the audience and those of you who will be tuning in. Thank you, Penn World Voices Festival. Just to let everyone know, this is not over yet. You can visit penn.org/festival to hear more from your favorite authors. And I will close out tonight. Have a great evening. Buonanotte a tutti, buonasera, and Jhumpa, grazie mille. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Grazie a te, Maaza.
È stato un piacere.
Anche per me.
Grazie.
Ciao, un
Grazie,
bacio.
ciao. Un bacio.